So me and my friends do something called PowerPoint Day. We prepare a presentation about anything we want and then we present it to everybody in the group. And I wanted to make a video of my first one that I did a couple of months ago to kind of practice speaking and presenting without a script, but also so that I can share it with other people that weren't in that initial group. So for my presentation, I'm going to be doing how to get into comics, a beginner's guide by a beginner. And for what I'll be talking about is I'm going to talk about why I love comics. I'm going to talk about what comics are, the comic storytelling form, superhero comics specifically, where to actually read comics, and then finally end on some recommendations. So back in middle school and high school, I was in AP English, and there were a lot of books that were assigned to us to read and take tests, analyze, talk about in class and whatnot. But a lot of these kind of flew over my head, so that kind of made me drop reading as a hobby because I was like, well, this is just kind of too much stuff and it doesn't really connect with me emotionally, and I kind of engage with these pieces of work only on an academic level. But then I realized, like 10 years after graduating high school, that doing required reading like that is kind of like trying to get into movies by watching every single Fast and Furious movie. And eventually, if you don't like Fast and Furious, you're gonna quit movies as a medium because that's what you assume all there is. But today, I'm going to be talking about comics and how that kind of brought me back into the hobby of reading recently in the past couple of years. So why do I love comics? So there's something called, for me, I call the mental load of imagination. After a long day of work, when I pop open a book, and there are a couple of like quote unquote books that I'm reading, when I'm reading these books, I'm really engaged with the characters and the themes that the author is presenting, and I'm really interested in what the author is trying to say. But the thing that is tough for me is that when I'm reading something, I get to the part when they're like, whoa, so this character goes into this house. The house is blue. The floor is wood. The ceilings are about 15 feet high. And then they start describing the house and they're describing what the characters are wearing. And then all of that kind of description puts that mental load of imagining the environment on to the reader. Whereas in comics, that imaginative load is put onto the creators. And that's kind of one of the things I love about comics, is that not only is there extremely talented writers, obviously regular books have amazing writers as well, but there's also amazing artists and inkers and a small team that actually creates comics. What you're seeing here is the Alex Ross Fantastic Four, and it just looks amazing. It's so detailed, and I could stare at this picture or this panel for like 15 minutes and still find new details to look at. That's one of the most awesome parts about reading comics, is kind of being presented a huge kind of diorama like this. Another thing I really appreciate about reading comics is that the pacing of tightly defined issues. And what I mean by that is that within certain types of comics, more like ongoing series or just issues, the story is divided into these kind of bite-sized issues, and each issue is generally about 26 pages long. So I know when I'm reading a story that there will be some satisfaction, conclusion, closure in about 26 pages, or at least some sort of cliffhanger or something to kind of keep me reading and keep me interested. I guess it's similar to a Netflix binge where you're watching it and then 50 minutes in, now there's a cliffhanger, now you want to watch the next one. And finally, there is like an academic satisfaction for me to reading superhero comics. And what I mean by that is I love culture, I love art, I love media, I love entertainment, but particularly the main thing I love is seeing how an idea evolves over time. And as I've been reading superhero comics, it's been really fascinating seeing things that I have seen before in movies, like, for example, the Into the Spider-Verse, Green Goblin, and then seeing it originally in its comic form. So that's been one of the coolest things about seeing, for example, Daredevil's black suit in Man Without Fear, or the Illuminati in the Multiverse of Madness. I read these comics beforehand and were really fascinated with those ideas and those visuals, that seeing it being interpreted and used in different ways is always really, really interesting to me. Probably because I also create art and love seeing the different strategies and different perspectives in how you can transform an existing idea. So I'm going to talk about what are comics now, just kind of like going to step one and building from there. So comics are a piece of written work that utilize both art and text to express an idea. That's just like the most basic way of understanding it. And this goes from comic strips like Garfield, or my personal favorite, Calvin and Hobbes, to big superhero epics. And that is probably one of the main misconceptions about comics, is that people usually assume that it's just superhero comics, but there's hundreds and a bunch of subgenres and genres within the medium of comics. For example, there's historical autobiographies like They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, experimental stories like My Favorite Thing Is Monsters, and there's a whole other world of Japanese comics called manga that is amazing in its own right. And just like any other form of entertainment, you kind of just pick what you like and what you want to read. Just movies, TV, games, just pick what you think is cool and then dive into that. Now let's talk about comic storytelling form. So there's two kind of buckets that I would put comic books into. There's short form and then there's long form. Short form comics are things like limited series, which is a specific number of issues within a series. And when you reach that final issue, the story is over. So you know exactly when the entire story is going to be finished, like The Many Deaths of Layla Starr. Then there's one shot, which is just a single issue, one and done, and that's not connected to any specific series. And then there's graphic novels like Sabrina, which kind of are like the quote-unquote normal books. It's just a single story told from front to back, and it's usually longer than a one-shot. So a comparison to other different types of media would be like, for example, short films, or just a regular movie, or those longer episodes that are treated kind of like movies within a TV series, like Finding Frances in Nathan For You. Then there's the most common, kind of most well-known version of comics, which is the ongoing series. These are like your standard comic book stories where it's just an indefinite amount of issues within a series. Or these other very well-known and prominent stories like The Walking Dead and Saga. And a parallel that can be made within the filmed medium is like streaming or TV shows or a web series. So let's get into some vocabulary. Also, we just kind of talked about it, but vocabulary to kind of help traverse and look for what you want within comics. So first off, there are one-shots. Like I mentioned, that's a one-shot issue. It's one and done. The story is over after you finish it. And then there's the issues that are part of a series. So what you're seeing is issues 1 through 3 in the 2021 Moon Knight series. And this can be a limited series or an ongoing series, but these issues are part of a larger story. Then there's volumes, and a volume collects multiple issues, usually in kind of like physical form that you can buy. That makes it just a little more convenient to get the story that you want. And finally, there's omnibuses, which is, as you can see, gigantic and collect essentially like multiple volumes of story. And sometimes they'll collect things across multiple series so that you get the most comprehensive, definitive vision of a story. So even though comic books have more than just the superhero genre, it is a huge part of the medium. So I do want to go into more detail so that if you are interested in superhero comics, then you can kind of have some tools and vocabulary to navigate it. First is storyline. This is a small narrative arc between issues, because sometimes issues don't have like a direct storyline from consecutive issues. So for example, this is the Extremis storyline, which is a 6-issue run within the Invincible Iron Man series. So when you were reading it, you would see Extremis Part 1. And you know at that point that you're getting into this storyline. So every consecutive issue after that will be about whatever this little storyline is. And storylines are perfect to adapt for movies. So that's why they adapted the Extremis storyline for Iron Man 3. A run is a consecutive run of issues within a series based on a creator. So usually you would say like the author's name, and then after that the series or character, then after that run. So this is, for example, Jason Aaron's Thor run. So it's the consecutive number of series that he wrote for Thor, and two storylines within his Thor run was Gore the God Butcher and the Mighty Thor, and that was adapted into the new Thor movie, Thor Love and Thunder. And an MCU parallel would be kind of like the Peyton Reed Ant-Man run, because he is the director for 1, 2, and 3. Next up are events. So events are the culmination of multiple storylines, series, and characters, and usually have to do with a big team up against a big bad, or a big clash, a big war, and it's kind of like a payoff for all the stories that you've been reading and seeing all these characters interact with each other. So for example, this is the Civil War event in the comics and was adapted for Captain America Civil War, which also acted as kind of a mini event between the Avengers movies. Next are ages or eras. And this is the time period in which everything produced within it follows some just general philosophy. They don't have to be exactly the same or anything, but because they're created in the same time period, you can see a lot of similarities between them. So you see here are the Marvel comic book eras, and they take place between, most of the time, a decade. And they've been getting more and more frequent as time has gone on. An MCU parallel to this is, of course, the sagas that they have. So phases 1 through 3 are the Infinity Saga, and then we're now in the Multiverse Saga. And in general, there's a lot of things I just said that might seem really overwhelming, but just pick what you gravitate towards, even before you read it. It might even be just how cool the cover looks, or how a character is described. And the best way to kind of get into it, and it's what I did, was I just put things in like best Batman storyline or best Miss Marvel run. So you kind of just pick a character that you feel like you would gravitate towards, and then search for runs, issues, storylines, and then that'll kind of give you your own personalized entry into comic books, specifically superhero comics. And again, like I mentioned, it can get really complicated. There's multiple reboots, relaunches, like with the DC stuff where they kind of like kill everything and then reboot it with new versions of characters that are updated for the time that they've been updated. There's so many different universes that are all connected to each other, like the Marvel Ultimate Universe and how they can cross between each other. But honestly, don't worry about it. don't get bogged down on the details. You don't have to read everything. There's so many comics within superheroes because there needs to be something for everybody, but not any single issue is for everybody. So just find the stuff that you want to see and then just keep drilling in there. Because my favorite part about reading comics, and if you do kind of like learn more details about it, is that it does provide lore and texture to what you're reading. And the reason I put Wong here is you don't need to know that Wong wanted a sandwich in Infinity War to understand his appearance in Multiverse of Madness. But knowing all the things that he's done throughout the MCU helps provide that texture and that just interesting backstory to his character. But most of the time, it's not necessary. And superhero comics do a pretty good job of recapping information that you do need to know. And some of them even provide references like, hey, to understand what reference we're making here, see Thor number 100 or whatever. For example, I started reading Infinity like years ago. And at the time, I really liked it. But there were certain characters here and there that I didn't really know. But in the end, was still kind of a satisfying read. However, now I'm going back and starting at the beginning of Jonathan Hickman's Marvel saga with Secret Warriors, S.H.I.E.L.D., and the Fantastic Four. And I can see all the things he begins to plant so early on. So now when I get to rereading Infinity, all that lore and texture, like I mentioned, will make that experience even better. And the last thing I want to mention with superhero comics is that it's not just the big two, which are DC and Marvel. There's a lot of other publishers out there that need attention and, have fantastic stories as well. So like IDW, Image Comics, and Dark Horse. So where do you actually read comics? I personally mostly rely on digital comics because it gives me a really fast and easy way to find stuff without actually having to go somewhere and hoping it's available and whatnot. So, but of course, the first thing you could do is go to a physical comic book location. And yeah, you can I think you can like subscribe to series and stuff, so you can get each issue as it comes out, or you can like get the volumes and omnibuses like we mentioned before. What I used to use the most was Comixology, which is kind of generally for all comics, and it's kind of linked to Amazon Kindle because Amazon bought Comixology and kind of revamped the app, not in the best way, but it's essentially like the Amazon Kindle app. So if you just generally want to dip your toe in, you can use Comixology and maybe look at a free trial or just 1 month of the Comixology Unlimited subscription, which gives you the first couple of issues for many series, especially all of the most well-known ones. So it's a great first thing to get, and it's generally how I got into digital comics. If you want to read either Marvel or DC, then they both have their own specific apps and subscriptions where you can kind of just dive into like every single comic ever made. Personally, I mostly use Marvel Unlimited because of, like I mentioned before, going through Jonathan Hickman's entire Marvel saga and kind of just diving into the history of all of the characters that I've loved. I've never used DC Universe Infinite. I think it's a little bit janky, but if you are super interested in DC, maybe it's good to give it a go for at least a trial. And then finally, there is the Shonen Jump manga app that I use. This one also provides weekly or bi-weekly updates and is as updated as when they come out in Japan, fully translated. And it's not as shiny or as polished as the previous apps I mentioned, but it's really good, super cheap, super usable, and it's kind of how I've been able to stay on top of all the new and upcoming mangas, and also going through the backlog and reading things that I've always been told to read in my backlog. So finally, let's get into some recommendations. Now that you're sold on comic books as a medium, here are a couple of comics that I feel like cover a pretty good range of stuff, but are also good entry points as well. So first off, it's Alan Moore's Batman: The Killing Joke. It's really short, really concise, amazingly written, and explores Batman and Joker's relationship through one of the most iconic Batman storylines ever written. And this one is All-Star Superman, which is one of my favorite comics of all time. It paints such a beautiful, nostalgic, and just kind of bittersweet view of Superman, and for me is just like the definitive Superman story. Next up is Marvels, which is amazingly drawn. It looks like beautiful paintings. Every single panel, every single page looks like the image that you see here, and it's essentially a normal person's perspective of the Marvel universe. So it's like this journalist, photographer, and you'll see these amazing shots of like giant people just towering over these people, but you don't see them from the superhero's perspective. You're on the ground looking up at these larger than life characters. Next up is Ultimate Spider-Man. I'm usually not one to love the classics, and I was really hesitant to go back and read these older Spider-Man comics because usually I'm like, well, people say they're classic, but usually it's just like the nostalgia glasses. I was wrong. Ultimate Spider-Man is amazing. Ultimate Spider-Man is one of the best comic series I've ever read. Every single issue is just so consistently high quality. And it's a great entry point for Spider-Man, but also is a great, just a great comic series in general for any fan. You don't even have to like Spider-Man to like it. It's just about a regular kid. Yeah, the writing, the art, everything about Ultimate Spider-Man is so good. I'm 5 volumes in, and I cannot stop reading it. It's amazing. Way of the House Husband is one of the very few times I have ever full on laughed out loud while reading something. It is hilarious and surprisingly amazingly drawn. It looks gorgeous, and the way that they do cuts to panels for punchlines is just the best. Black Hole is an indie graphic novel that kind of talks about growing up through these really kind of fucked up images, and is really kind of grotesque and disturbing, but it's kind of the perfect way to depict puberty and growing up and just learning how to be yourself. After you've gotten more into comics, reading Watchmen is basically like reading a teardown of what superhero comics are while creating one of the best superhero comics of all time. It's my personal favorite graphic novel or comic of all time. The art is fantastic, even though it's older. The writing is ridiculous, and having the context of DC and Marvel and kind of traditional superhero comics makes Watchmen even more fun to read. Finally, after you've read some comics and kind of understand the general lingo, understanding comics The Invisible Art is fantastic. It essentially is a breakdown of what comics are form-wise, technique, and just kind of like art in general and how comics are made. It's beautiful and it's so informative. If you're interested in how comics are made in general, or just how art is made in general, I 100% recommend understanding comics. But yeah, that is my presentation on comic books, and please let me know if that was helpful at all and what I can do to improve. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for watching.